Investment in hydrogen energy to power vehicle and heat homes will create thousands of new jobs and reduce carbon emissions, according to a new government strategy. Ministers hope the industry will attract billions of pounds in investment. It's thought the fuel could account for a third of the UK's energy use by the middle of the century. Environmental campaigners, though, say there should be more focus on renewably sourced hydrogen. Well, let's talk to Tim Harper now. Tim is Chief Executive of the hydrogen company Element 2 and has been supporting the work the government's been doing on developing this hydrogen strategy. Tim Harper, thank you very much for being with us on BBC News. Could you just kind of take us back to basics, really? What is it that makes hydrogen a sustainable fuel?
OK, well, look, the energy that we're using has to come from somewhere. And for the last 100 years or 200 years, we've been digging it out of the ground, out of oil wells or gas reservoirs. And you know, we know all about the problems that's causing. So the idea behind hydrogen is it's something you can create out of renewable energy, things like sort of renewable wind, offshore wind, geothermal, whatever you want to do. And hydrogen, it just allows you to store that energy in a form that you can use it where batteries can't reach, for example, in long-distance transport.
In terms of the kind of practicalities of this, I mean, I noticed you're talking about Element 2 decarbonising 13% of the UK emissions by 2030. The government strategy says it's conceivable a third of all energy could be produced this way by 2050. What are the things that stand in the way of achieving that?
Well, there's two things. One is the technology for producing the hydrogen. Now, we're lucky in that respect, in that hydrogen has been around for 20 odd years, and 20 years ago it was a nice to have, but now with net zero, with decarbonisation, with 1.5 degree global warming, it's a must have. So we're lucky that a lot of the technology is available off the shelf, and then the real challenge is just scaling that up quickly enough. Now, fortunately, you know, with things like offshore wind, with solar and other renewables, we've got a source of that electricity that you can then use to create the hydrogen that we're going to need. But we are going to need quite a huge amount of hydrogen-based energy.
I wonder if there's a bit of a contradiction in the government strategy, because it's talking about sourcing hydrogen from fossil fuels.
Yes, well, there's a whole spectrum of colours of hydrogen, but the main two that people are discussing at the moment is blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. So green hydrogen, the sort that we're basing our business on, is 100% renewable. So it comes from offshore solar, it comes from recycled waste, all of these kind of areas. Whereas the blue hydrogen is effectively methane, and that's combined with carbon capture, utilisation and storage to make it blue. Otherwise it would be what's called grey hydrogen, which is what you would just get if you just took natural gas and turned it into hydrogen, removed the carbon.
Just to clarify that, so the blue hydrogen, inverted commas, that the government's talking about, actually, we're not even ready for that, are we? Because I mean, carbon capture and storage is something we talk a lot about. And ministers are always putting it in their speeches, saying we've got this marvellous thing, but actually the technology has not yet got to the stage where it's kind of commercially viable. Is that right?
Well, I think that's why a lot of government strategies tend to hedge their bets a little bit, because there's always this assumption that somebody will come up with the technology between now and when the targets are set, and hence, you know, the targets are 2040, 2050 to give people time to do that. Now, I mean, it is an area that's moving fast, but as with everything else in hydrogen, it was just sort of bumbling along because there wasn't much demand for the last 20 years, and one, you know, the challenge really is to scale up those technologies at industrial scale.
And now at least you've got government seriously interested and therefore engaged in doing this, which presumably helps in terms of kind of then helping to create the interest that helps to create the market that will then help to make this more affordable. I mean, you're talking in the case of Element 2, your company, about doing this without public subsidy. That sounds quite an ambitious thing to be aiming for.
Well, not really. I mean, it all comes down to the economics, and we think we can source enough green hydrogen within the next 2 to 3 years to be able to supply the transport industry. And by transport, I mean there's buses, heavy trucks, freight, and get that down to a cost that is comparable with diesel in terms of the cost of ownership. So the economics work pretty well. Now, government support is always useful, but I think if you sit on your hands waiting for the government to come up with a strategy, then you find yourself at the back of the race. And we took a decision a couple of years ago that someone needed to crack this chicken and egg situation, which was basically where can I fill something up with hydrogen? So we've gone out and we've raised private capital to enable us to build out the infrastructure. And it's a little bit like the early days of EVs in that you could buy an electric car that go anywhere if you couldn't charge it. And hydrogen is exactly the same. So you have to have a certain coverage of infrastructure for people to be able to make that switch away from diesel into hydrogen.
Tim Harper, it's fascinating stuff. Thank you very much for talking to us. Tim Harper, Chief Executive of Element 2 there on the government's new hydrogen strategy. Now, look at the weather. Here's Darren Betts.